That's recording. Okay. It's not recording yet because I can see up on.
Today is July 29th, 2008 at the Mary L. Cook Public Library. We're interviewing today Robert Richards. Mr. Richards, if you could tell us a little bit about your background.
Prior to service, I was working with a blower and fan company in Niles, Michigan. My father had been president of it, and he had a heart attack, so it occasioned my going back to work there, which I had no intention of doing originally. But anyway, I had to help out, and that's what I did. There was a bad fire at the plant, and it was necessary that somebody try to recover the records, which was not too easy a job. We did manage to get a lot of it back. In 1940, I married my wife, who was also from Niles. We were both in the same class in high school, no other connection. We started building a house, which we couldn't get into until March of 1941. And we started building that house on $25 a week salary. So things are quite different today. In 1943, when the war began, it didn't begin, it was already going well into the war. There was an occasion when I could have been drafted, but I decided that if I were going into service, I would choose what I wanted. And I chose the Navy. I went to Chicago for the examination, and they waived what I have in a crooked left elbow, which I broke when I was 4 years old, and gave me orders as an ensign. And I had orders to report to Brooklyn Navy Yard in 5 days. Well, that was quite a sudden shock to have to get going. I went over to Gilbert's in South Bend to buy my uniforms, not knowing much about anything except what to get. Made my way to Brooklyn, and on the streets of Brooklyn, they passed many military people. I didn't know who to salute or who to have salute me, so I was in kind of bad condition that way. But I did get into the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and it was really a temporary stop on the route to the Supply Corps School in Boston, but a very interesting one. Lived out on Long Island part-time after Brooklyn. And in October, we went on to Boston, to Wellesley, because Harvard Supply Corps School was too full to take all the people going in. So the Wellesley people gave us 2 dormitories on their quadrangle, which we served in until February of '44, when we drove back to Michigan. And shortly thereafter, took the train from Niles on the old Michigan Central, and into Chicago to take the train out to the West Coast. And we went to San Francisco. We were billeted on Treasure Island until the ship loaded for Hawaii. And that ship, I recall, was an Army ship, but it rolled and rolled and rolled. The Navy people purposely tried to stay non-seasick, and the Army people just threw up all over. But in Hawaii, I landed at Pearl Harbor and took a flight over to Maui. I never knew where Maui was. When I got the orders, it could have been anywhere in the world. But it was, of course, another island of the Hawaiians, and a very beautiful one. And joined the 48th NCB there. The existing supply officer was about to return to the States, and I was to take over his job, which I did. And we spent 3 months in Hawaii building a rest camp for the Marines, primarily, who were coming back from the Pacific. When it came time to ship out, we had a ride on a beautiful Holland America ship Maui to Pearl Harbor. And then they transferred us to an old Army sea barge, which is called one of the Liberty ships. They served us 2 meals a day and give us an apple for lunch. We spent 52 days going from Hawaii to Guam, and we were stalled because of the invasion of Guam was not fully completed. We stopped at Eniwetok and Kwajalein in the Marshall Islands. And I remember going ashore. I was the only one allowed ashore at Kwajalein to try to get salt water soap, which is in short supply on the ship. And that's the only time in my time in the Navy that I had a cup of coffee, because there wasn't anything else to eat in the mess. So we went on from there. There were some alerts about submarines in the area. We had destroyers accompanying us. And at one time a carrier joined us, but it took off away from the Marshalls. No incidents of anything happening was extremely boring, because there wasn't anything you could do except read or lie on deck. And we finally got into Guam. And I was quite sick. I'd probably eaten something that didn't agree with me, and I was supposed to be unloading the ship as part of my duties, and I struggled to do that. We did get everything ashore in the mud and whatever. We were out in the open. There was no choice, on the edge of a swamp, and a lot of dead Japanese lying in that swamp. And I remember one night, we had our heads set right up on the edge of the swamp. Our doctor had diarrhea or something. He had to try to go, and the gunshot started. I don't know what happened, but he turned around and went back to his tent. It could get pretty exciting at times, because there were a lot of Japanese still on the island, and many of them hiding out and hid out for quite some time after the island was secured. We did have an American who lived all through the Japanese occupation of the island in caves, and I suspect the Japanese did the same thing. But it depended on how they were favored by the native peoples as to whether they could exist or not. But I do remember some of them coming into camp, scrounging through our trash and dumps to get something to eat, and being captured occasionally. There were a number of our people killed by the Japanese because they were so prevalent and still had their weapons.
And this was 44, around 44?
This is in 44, yes.
And that was the bulk of your time was in Guam?
Yes,
Okay.
all of it, right,
All of it.
except for the Hawaii duty.
Okay.
That's 15 months overseas, and 3 of it was Hawaii.
If we can backtrack just a minute about your educational background, can you tell me a little bit about your education before you entered the service?
Well, I went to, from high school, stayed out a year before I went to college because I didn't know what to do. And I wanted to be a journalist. My dad didn't think that was a good idea. He recommended accounting and to go on to law. Well, I did the accounting at Notre Dame. I started in 34, finished in 38, played in the band, marched the field many times, and some of the foreign fields where we played out of South Bend. But I finished in accounting, Bachelor of Science in Commerce, and never used accounting until I got to Dayton. I was in production, mostly in the factory where my dad had been president, and did a lot of things, even learned how to draft, which I never had any education in. But it was a good experience from the standpoint of managing people. And when I got to Dayton, then it was a different occasion. I did have accounting then, because my brother and I had a small company that we bought, and it required a lot of of supervision. He was the engineer on his account, so it balanced out pretty well.
And then you said you were assigned as an ensign. In case someone's watching that and isn't familiar what that is, can you explain the duties of an ensign? What is their main responsibility?
Well, in the supply corps, your main responsibility is supplies, to supply the regiment, battalion, whatever you can scrounge. And on Guam, it was a scrounging job. I remember trading nails for shoes for the Marines. We would get things from the Naval Air Base that was there. We'd get things from the hospital, field hospitals that were there. Anything you could do. You needed tires, you needed clothing, and it was just a case of getting around to the various organizations on the island to find all these things.
So did you have supply ships coming in on an irregular basis to Guam?
Yes, the supply ships would come into the port, and we would be responsible for checking them in and safeguarding them, because some of them were beer. There was a lot of Coca-Cola, but nobody worried about stealing that, but the beer, that was precious.
And then, as you were there, they were overseeing the building of facilities, correct?
That's right, putting up Quonset huts and building North Field for the B-29s to fly and bomb Japan. That North Field is still there, and it's called Anderson Field today. But it was a very unusual one because it went down like this and then up. And if you didn't make it on the up, you were in the ocean. You dropped off a cliff.
Okay.
But it was a tremendous job in the Seabees. I have a great admiration for the men of the Seabees that were there at the time I was, because they were former civilian workers and truly knew their trades. And rough and tough, but they got the job done. They built a lot on the island, even helped the natives restore some of their places that had been hit by bombs.
So at this time period, the Americans had taken over from the Japanese, correct? It was under a reconstruction period, basically. And then, was it also a command center of sorts for that area of the Pacific?
Very definitely. We built Admiral Nimitz headquarters for the South Pacific. It was on Guam. And that was our battalion.
Why was Guam important? What, strategically, why was?
Well, it was close enough to Japan to be able to send bombers out from there and have them return. So its main importance was, of course, strategic. And the bombers, I remember, beautiful ships, came back sometimes with not all their bombs unloaded. They dropped them on Rhode Island, which is just north of us.
Okay, tell me a little bit more about Rhode Island.
Well, it's a fairly small compared to Guam, but still sufficient to maintain a large Japanese garrison. And when the war was about over, we were allowed, as a group, we took a group of our 48th NCB to go over and go on the island, even though the Japanese commander knew that they were about done, but he hadn't heard of any surrender yet. He allowed us to come on the island and set up water supplies. The sanitation facilities were pretty bad, and people were quite primitive. But I remember we put up a sign when the Marines came ashore after us. We had a sign that appeared in the Chicago Tribune: the 48th NCB welcomes the Marines to Rhode Island.
So when you got there, you did some water improvements, that sort of thing?
You know, set up sanitation, because they had no toilet facilities at all. In fact, they didn't know how to use them. We set up the normal, what you call the old primitive privies. They couldn't sit on the seats.
Anything else happen there?
Not a lot. Of course, toured the island and looked into various places, caves and so forth. And I gave Phil a Japanese sword that we found in one of the caves. And he's given it on to somebody else. We had a number of Japanese objects that we split up among the personnel there. It was back and forth from Guam to Rota. We didn't get separated entirely from our Guam responsibilities. So after we got everything set up pretty well in Rota, I went back to Guam and finished up the details there. Always hopeful that we'd be going home, because at this time it was 45 and Germany had surrendered. And we felt that it might be imminent that we'd be replaced as a battalion and go home as a unit, which didn't happen. But we eventually got home anyway.
So what was your day-to-day life like? Did you keep a regular daily schedule?
Yeah, it was mostly, of course, a lot of paperwork, a lot of running around the island procuring supplies. And the thing that impressed me in going through the diaries I have is how many movies I saw. I could not believe it. Frankly, every night we had a movie, good or bad. And I think we began to hate Republic Pictures because everything they turned out was terrible. I do remember seeing John Wayne in The Fighting Seabees, his last moments in the film where he's driving a bulldozer to push the Japanese back and gets shot and dies. That was kind of laughable in a way, because the way they do pictures isn't exactly the way the CDs are.
And then you said you were also, there were Marines in the Army also on Guam at the same time you were
Yes,
there.
the Army was designated to take Guam, and it was a very slow process. No disrespect to the Army, but I think Marines are truly greater fighters than the Army and would have captured it sooner. But that was a delay in our getting there. We couldn't unload until we were fairly well secured.
And then the Marines were in what capacity there?
Just maybe to keep the island secure and search out any stray Japanese. I remember them coming into camp and wanting ice from our ice machines. We were pretty well equipped. Our commander was quite foreseeing, and we had prefabricated heads so that when he got there, they were set up immediately. Usually 8 holders, which were quite busy in the morning, and a lot of social activity. But he also provided with generators and ice machines, and of course the galley equipment was all prepared beforehand. When we left Hawaii and loaded up everything that we could, including a Jeep that was sitting on the dock, I don't know, it belonged to, but we took it anyway. He was very good about planning ahead. And of course, that was part of my job, was planning ahead too.
And I heard you were pretty popular on the island.
Didn't know that.
Were you popular about the paychecks and all that?
Oh, well, I helped with the paycheck.
Yeah.
That was part of my sub-duty. The regular pay officer needed help, and somebody with a gun on his hip, in case something would come up. Generally, there was no disturbance. We paid out thousands of dollars. In fact, when I landed in Hawaii and joined the battalion there, the supply officer turned over $250,000 to me.
And they had nowhere to spend it there, correct?
We had a ship store.
Okay.
They could buy things. They could buy beer. We had to ration beer. And one chief petty officer said, if I can't have 12 bottles at a time, I don't want any, because we were rationing out 2 at a time. He never got 12, unless he stole it. We did have some break-ins to the beer tent.
I'll bet. And then, otherwise, did you have much problem getting communications from home, or was that fairly regular?
Well, that was interesting because after I arrived on Guam, I got one letter. And some time later, I got 10 letters. And some time later, I got 16 letters in one time. So it wasn't very regular that she got them. But they did come. My wife wrote every day and I wrote every day. So
And at that time, you had no children?
No.
Is that correct?
they weren't in the pictures.
Okay. What else would
We
you?
had 2 dogs though.
What else would you like to talk about your experience there?
I think the friendships that you form with the people, not just officers, but enlisted men. My group of storekeepers, we formed a very close group and protected the supplies as much as we could. Had to stand duty sometimes to do it. The coffee was always perking in the warehouse. Some I still remember, some the Patsy Grasso was our ship's cook, our battalion's cook. And Sam Anderegg was from over in eastern Ohio. And Ray, one of my chief storekeepers, was really good about working with them. I conducted classes in supply on the island almost every night to keep them up to date on what I'd learned at Wellesley. And besides the movies, which were every night. And I remember on Hawaii, I was teaching accounting classes. So tried to keep busy doing things, and there was a lot of time when you just wanted to sleep. And they did plenty of that, especially on Sundays when the activity was down. I remember riding in I had a weapons carrier, not a Jeep, because I could carry supplies in it. I don't know whether you know what that is.
No, can you describe that?
It's a much larger vehicle than a Jeep. It does have a convertible top. Most of the time it was down because Guam is considered the white man's tropics. And what you get maybe is a daily shower, and you ride right through it with the top down, and in a very short time you're dry again, so we didn't worry about it. But that weapons carrier was so handy for getting around the island because it was built more like half Jeep and half truck. And I do have a license, which I brought with me that I had on Guam. I was entitled to drive a 1-ton truck, but I don't recall that I ever did that.
Was it mostly tropical all the time? You had little variation at any time of the year?
The only time you'd have any variation would be when a typhoon would come along, and that wasn't too frequent. But you always had, as I mentioned, showers. It, almost every day.
Was there a typhoon season like we have a hurricane season? And what time of the year would that be?
As I recall, I think it was around September, but we weren't affected by it too much.
Okay. Just in case someone isn't familiar, how large is a battalion?
It's
Approximately.
I want to say 1,000. I'm not sure that's right.
Okay. So many units.
Yeah, they're made up of regiments.
Right. And are there other events that are highlights that stand out in your mind about your time?
Well, I mentioned I do remember the visit of William Huey as a journalist who came to the battalion, and we had quite an opportunity to talk with him. And he told us a lot about things that went on in Europe because he was over there. And he also interviewed us on our battalion activities mentioned in one issue of Life, which I can't scrounge now, there was a picture of our ship store and some other facilities. We had all the Margaret's, the Chamorro girls that did the laundry. We had Filipinos that served in the officers' dining. We had black stewards who were not allowed to mix with the whites at that time. They prepared all the food for the officers. In the galley itself, for the enlisted men, of course, they had all white servers. And they were very conscious of the separation of the two races at the time. The Filipinos served strictly with the officers. And they kept, there were some other mixes that were in service to the Navy. They weren't enlisted, they were just people that were hired. We tried to hire more girls for the laundry, we couldn't get them because the load of laundry, as you can imagine, is quite terrific. And the store itself served all of the personnel that wanted to come, not just our battalion, from the island establishments. I don't think the native peoples themselves showed up too much. But any other military people were entitled to come.
What was the response of the Native people to your presence there?
Oh, they were most happy to see the Americans back, for the most part. Now, some of them had allied themselves with the Japanese over the period of time that they were occupied. So they probably weren't too happy, and they were probably sheltering some of these Japanese that were hiding out. But for the most part, we were treated extremely well. And we did things with the native peoples to help them.
Was yours more of a period of reconstruction, do you think?
Well, it was more setting up bases
Okay.
on the island. You know, the damage done to the island by bombings and that sort of thing. We tried to help them as we could. It was up to the natives to do their own work.
What other memories do you have of your time in the service?
Well, I do remember back in Wellesley of being out on the quadrangle at 6:30 in the morning doing calisthenics, and it was dark, and the girls were still sleeping in. That was always an impressionable thing. They invited us to roll the hoops with them, which is a regular thing in Wellesley. But I think we declined. They were very disappointed with the class, because they thought they were going to get a bunch of young men, but 75% of us were married. So.
And that was a common thing then for a college to designate barracks for military?
I don't know how
troops?
far that went.
Okay.
I'm only aware of it as far as Wellesley is concerned.
And what other things do you want us to cover today? What other things do we need to talk about?
It's a rather broad question.
Are there certain time periods that are more prominent in your memory than others? That something that is there a message that you would like to get out, or a message that you would like to leave us with?
Only the camaraderie of the military, which is really quite deep, forms some really good friendships, which now are all disappeared. But at the time, they were very important. And we did a lot of things together. We played volleyball quite often. We would swim good swimming, good beaches. And I remember swimming at one point on Rhode Island, particularly, when a big ray swam by, but no harm. They don't even threaten you. But I also remember a Japanese man, he was a civilian, squatting down on the beach. For over an hour he squatted there, and I don't know how he did it. He got up again without any problem.
Did you feel that you were in danger most of the time, seldom?
Not most of the time. I did feel it one time. I went up to Admiral Nimitz headquarters, which was in the building process, and I took a road down through the wild part. And I realized then I shouldn't have done that because these Japanese were still around with weapons, and I could easily have been shot. Fortunately, I survived. There was no indication of the danger, but I knew it could be around there.
Did you personally lose friends in your unit or people that you were well acquainted with?
Yes, we did lose a couple of officers to Japanese fire.
And that was there in that location.
On Guam.
And what else?
Well, I knew my brother was close by. He had been in the European theater and came back to America to train to go out to the Pacific. He was in the Army. And I know he went right close along the shore of Guam to get to the Philippines, but there was no way of connecting with him.
And did you learn about that secondhand or?
I
Yeah.
learned about it afterwards.
Now, when you came back from the service, how was your travel back? You came back on Army ship, you said.
It
How
was a
long did
Navy-
that take?
Navy ship.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah. I thought we'd go back as a battalion, but it didn't happen that way. And I went back as an individual. And this time, from Guam to Los Angeles, or Port of Los Angeles, it took 15 days. And I remember that so well because I just was pushing to get back to the States. I didn't want to paddle. I did get into, it's not Los Angeles, Long Beach, and was put up there until I could get transportation home.
Now, is there a reason that you came at a time when your battalion did not? Or,
Yeah, they broke up the battalion,
okay.
sent it back in individual units
What was it like when you arrived?
in the States.
Yes.
It was glorious. But when I was discharged at Great Lakes in Illinois, and still hold a commission, never resigned the commission. When I got home, it's like coming home to a stranger. You just can't imagine, you really have to plan.
So how long was the delay from California to home?
Well, probably about 6 days.
Okay. Did you pick up in the family business at that point, or did you go into a different job then?
I went back to the fan business. It really was known by the family. My dad had died, and I was just another employee.
Mhm. So what did you do then when you came back? Were you still in accounting?
No, I was working in the production end of the factory. I
And-
brought my cousin in to fill in for me while I was gone. And so I really put him out of a job. It was all right to come back, but it didn't seem to be the same. And I wasn't satisfied, and later on moved to other things.
So you were there for a couple years or so forth?
That would be 46, and I left there around 50. Yeah, been about 4 or 5 years there.
And then you went on, you said you started another business. Was that at that time or later on?
No, I went to study for ministry
Okay.
over in Evanston, Illinois. And that didn't last long. I just didn't fit in. I was 30-something then, and all the candidates were in their 20s. It just wasn't a good mix. I decided that wasn't for me. So I went back and got a job at Conair Company in Niles, which was the largest architectural manufacturer in the country. And stayed with them for about 7 years before my brother and I were able to buy out the company in Dayton.
Is this the same brother that was going to the Philippines?
Yes.
Okay. How many siblings are in your family?
We had 2 brothers. One of them was cerebral palsy, so he was totally incapacitated, except his mind was good. But he couldn't do anything for himself. And my oldest brother, is the engineer. And he just died here recently at 97 years.
Then, during this time you had a family. How many children do you have?
2 of them are right here.
Okay. Since we do have family members here with us, is there anything that you would like to add from your perspective to anything, any stories your dad might have told you, or he's done a pretty good job of covering?
Well, I think the thing I remember most was when Dad was still in the reserves, he would, we'd be in the living room at home in Niles and something or other, and here'd come in Dad in his dress whites going off to the reserve meeting. Handsome man, very handsome man. Looked very good in the uniform.
I didn't mention that part of it, that when I
You
didn't
were in the reserves.
come home, I went to the South Bend to be in the reserves, active in the reserves.
How many years were you in that?
Well, when did the Korean War start? 50s?
1950.
Yeah, when that started, I was offered lieutenant commander, and I didn't take it because every supply officer in the reserve at that time was being called out to Korea. And if I had stayed a lieutenant, I was too old in rank. So in a way, I was escaping another war.
Okay. So you completed that time in the reserves then, and that was,
I never completed it.
okay.
I probably stayed in the reserve several years.
Do you still stay in touch with anyone that you served with?
There's nobody I know of.
Did you for a
I
while?
didn't mention Danny Prue is a Dayton native, and he was in the 72nd NCB on Guam. We were at Wellesley together and formed a very close friendship. He got sent on to Japan, which he very much wanted to go home. I know he did, because everyone does. But we separated then because he took a unit to Japan. And when he came back, I didn't have much more contact with him until I came to Dayton, moved to Dayton, and then looked him up. And we reestablished a friendship then. He has since died. And I think many of my classmates have probably died by now. I've only had contact with one of the battalion officers, and that was Ray Kepke, who stopped at the house one time when I wasn't home, but he talked to Angela, my wife, and I just regretted not being able to see him again.
You talked about having diaries that you kept. Did you keep them daily or just
Daily.
off and on?
Daily.
Is there anything in there that you would like to share an excerpt with, or something that you would like to share with other people, or not really?
Well, there's nothing that couldn't be shared, but a lot of it's movies. As I mentioned, one practically every night, and volleyball and that sort of thing. The other was the fellowship with the fellow officers in the battalion and other battalions. And even the Army, I was calling on Colonel Rockwell of the Army to get supplies. He was a supply officer for the Army, and we traded back and forth on many things. So he's mentioned quite a bit in there.
And I did want to go back and touch on Mr. Huey. He was what capacity? In case someone doesn't know who that is, who is he?
William Huey?
Yes.
He was a journalist.
For?
He, I don't even know who he wrote for.
Okay.
But he did get into Life magazine. So he probably was a journalist that peddled his condoms wherever he could.
Okay.
He was very well known at the time.
And the magazine that you have there is a Life magazine from the 40s, from during your time, correct?
Yeah, it shows our battalion in the buildings they were putting up.
Can you talk a little bit about the type of buildings that you constructed? Were they mostly just your basic one-level building, or?
Quonset huts,
Okay.
a lot of.
Explain that. Explain what that is.
Quonset hut is just a rounded roof and very long, used for all kinds of storage purposes or personnel, which was another thing. We lived in tents on Guam with the rats, and just didn't keep food in the tent.
Were rats a big problem?
Not a problem. We existed with them.
And was it one man per tent?
Oh, no.
How
At
many?
least 2, sometimes 4,
Okay.
depending on the size of the tent. Generally, I recall it was 2 when I finished up there.
Did you have much air coverage at the time you were there? Was it constant or not so much?
Air raids?
Yes.
Occasionally. And they, as I wrote in there, I think the other pay officer slept with me in the tent. We didn't even bother to get up. Just another occasion. It got to be that way.
So when was the total, when did the forces leave, or when did they sort of wrap up their work on the island? Was that after you left?
It was being done while I was there. We were trying to get everything we could back on the advanced base depot. And I didn't mention that before, but I was in charge of the advanced base depot for a while.
And what is
Ships
that?
coming in. That's an area that's set aside on the island to unload materials which were going forward to the other islands beyond
Okay.
as the war progressed. But they had to put them someplace until they could be requisitioned. And that was a real job, because those ships came in. Materials came at you in boxes, everything they could. And you had to find a place to establish them so you could find them later when you needed it and record all of them where they were.
So when that happened, did everybody just kind of come to work on that?
Well, my storekeepers did, but not many of the other personnel. There even was a shipload of tanks came in one day, and unload all those, give them to where they're supposed to go.
Was it a muddy sort of a situation, or?
Could be when it rained. When we first landed, I remember the mud particularly, because we had to sleep under tarps, whatever we could. I slept with the supplies. And you would get up and be all mud when you.
So the trails and all that, they were mostly just for Jeep travel or foot travel? That was basic, the way you got around on the islands? They were not
Oh, no, we began to build roads right away.
improved roads?
Yeah, even asphalt. We had good roads set up over the island.
And so by the time you left, how different was the island from when you came?
It looked a lot better, because the village of Magana particularly been pretty well rebuilt, and with the help of the Seabees. So it was a thriving community again. And we went around the rest of the island and looked at various villages. And they were not hit like Uganda was, but we helped them where we could. And that was part of our purpose, was to get out and see what was happening on the island. We couldn't drive all the way around. Good on road. There were some kind of roads. I remember coming to one place where you just dropped off into the sea and you continued.
So it was a sort of what I would picture as a rainforest type of a
Tropical.
environment.
No, I don't know what you call it, rainforest.
Did you have snakes?
No, no snakes.
Okay. Any other type of wildlife that we're unfamiliar with? That
There were boars. And goats aren't wildlife, but they were there. In fact, we had goats in the battalion so we could get fresh milk. Powdered milk was awful.
Did the people there mainly have just an agricultural setup where they just mainly dealt with their own family unit? Is that how they existed, or what was it like for the normal person that lived on the island?
Well, they had plantations and grew sugar cane and, of course, plenty of coconuts. Our ingenious enlisted men found a way to make tuba juice. It's made out of the palm some way. It's not the coconut itself. They found that out, so they had their own alcohol. The families tried to find occupation with the military because money was scarce with them. And there were plenty of jobs for them to do. I think many of them made out quite well.
And the plantations were the main source of commerce for the island?
Yes.
Is there anything else that we need to touch on before we end our interview?
Well, there'll probably always be bits and pieces that come to mind. You have anything, Claire?
I think you should say something more on the fact of how black students and how they were treated and how that bothered you.
We treated them quite well because they were serving us as officers. They just were segregated.
And that bothered you, yes.
Well, you know, I've never been in favor of racial segregation. And it took Truman to change it.
I remember your commenting also on how the Japanese treated the residents of Rota rather badly.
Well, they did. Made them almost slaves.
Is there a reason for that?
Only their particular view of life, that these are captured people, and they want to make the most of them to serve them. I didn't mention the fact that there wasn't much Japanese equipment on the islands as we took them. I think on Rota I only ran across one bulldozer, which indicated it was all handwork. And that's where the natives came in. They were put to work building airfields or other types of activity. The Chamorro people are distinct from the Filipinos, the Marshall Islands, the Gilberts, or whatever. They're their own people and they have their own language. But they got mixed up with the Spanish and the Filipinos. So they're quite a different people, relatively short. And they were Christian for the most part until the Japanese came. But they did have their churches on Guam. Of course, Guam was American before the Japanese took over. Tinian and Saipan were all controlled by the Japanese prior to the war.
Anything else that you'd like to bring up?
Is there any general feeling or comment or thoughts on dropping of the bombs?
Which way? Our dropping bombs?
Well, thinking Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Oh, of course, that came quite a bit after.
That was after you were already home?
Yeah, that was right near the end of the war.
Okay, okay, I wasn't sure on the time frame there.
No, we wouldn't have any reading on that out in the islands,
Okay.
how they felt.
Was your communication mainly just radio, or were you able to, did you have radios? Could you listen to a radio?
Yes, we got Tokyo Roads.
Okay. And that's
Yeah.
basically it?
I remember scrounging up a radio somewhere so we could listen to all the goings on. So we were not out of communication. We had, of course, battalion communications
Right.
as to world events. And there was a paper published, passed around. But no, we were pretty up to date on progress of the war.
Mhm.
And you mentioned the A-bombs were in August, if I remember right. And I was still out in the islands. So I don't remember the reaction. I get much more reaction after I get home than I did there.
The war is over. I would think that would be the prevalent feeling.
Right.
Do you remember that day? When the war was
Yes,
over?
I remember Roosevelt's death more,
Hmm.
for some reason.
What was that like, that day?
It was a pretty sad day because of his position
Uh-huh.
as commander-in-chief. And the man we looked to guide the country in war and after war.
Was there a feeling that people were uncertain about what would happen next at his
You know,
passing?
it was a loss, certainly, and we had no idea what Truman might be like. I won't say that Roosevelt was ever a favorite of my family, being all Republicans, but he still did a tremendous job. I have to give him a lot of credit. I give as much credit to Truman for what decision he had to make, which was horrendous. I don't know how he did it, really. But if he hadn't done it, we'd have been fighting the streets of Tokyo.
You're referring to the dropping of the atomic bombs. Okay. Anything else we need to get into the interview?
Well, I'd like to, if I could think of them.
Take your time, you've got a couple minutes if there's something that you want to think about.
It was an experience that wouldn't say I enjoyed, but I'm glad I was in it, and I wouldn't have missed it. Wouldn't want to go back again.
Does it, how does it color your outlook on today's military, or what do you think about today's military?
I have a lot of sympathy for today's military, and think they're going through just as bad a time as we've been through, maybe worse. The weapons today are so much different. The planes are so much different. They have suicide bombers now on the streets. We had Japanese kamikazes. Same thing, ready to die for their country.
Do you have any advice about the military, or for a young person thinking about the military, what do you think? What would you like to tell them?
Well, if they're willing to serve, I think it's a wonderful opportunity. but you're dealing on the edge of death. And you have to realize that. But they can learn so much about life and about other people's. It's a cultural explosion that you run into. I think we learned a lot out in the Pacific about other people's. Not Hawaiians particularly, because they're just like Americans and are. But the native peoples on the islands was quite different, seeing how they live and work.
Okay, well, unless you have any closing comment, I think our time is about up, so we will close here. We're at the Mary L. Cook Public Library, Waynesville, Ohio, with Robert W. Richards, who served from 1943 to 1946, World War II in the Pacific. Thank you.